Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In the Star Wars galaxy, humans on average live to be around 70 to 80 years old. Compared to other species like the Hutts, who can live up to 1,000 years, or the Wookiees, who can live for a few hundred years, we are relatively short-lived. Yeah, in the short time period we are alive, we seem to accomplish a lot more than any other race. It's almost as if we are aware of our own mortality and constantly driven by that ticking clock. But what about species that have even shorter lifespans than human beings? Will they be even more driven to succeed in a shorter period of time? Or are humans in a Goldilocks zone for a lifespan that creates optimal motivation and drive? Well, today we're going to take a look at some species with the shortest average lifespan in the galaxy. So we're going to start off with a few different species who all have an average lifespan of around 65 years. First, we have the Geonosians, an insectoid species with a very communal hive mind-like society surrounding a queen. While the Geonosian queens will have a much longer lifespan, the average worker drone becomes an adult at the age of 7 and is expected to contribute very early on to the colony. Life can be really brutal for these worker drones, and work usually means either heavy manual labor or fighting as a conscript on the front lines. Many Geonosians would be used in zero gravity to build the Death Star. The lack of focus on individuality in Geonosian society most likely negatively affects the species' lifespan. Accidental and gruesome deaths were not uncommon in Geonosian society, and so any Geonosian who is lucky enough to reach 50 years in age is considered pretty old. Then we have the Trandoshans. These were sentient reptilian humanoids known for their brutal physical strength, terrific senses, and passion for hunting. I mean, they loved hunting so much that their entire religion is basically built on hunting and worshiping a god known as the Game Master. So it's not surprising that the amount of accidental deaths amongst the Trandoshans is also going to be quite high and skews their average lifespan of 65 years in age. Although it should be noted that Trandoshans do have remarkable regeneration abilities which allow them to slowly regrow limbs if, say, they, piss off a fully grown Wookiee in a cantina. Next up with a 65-year average lifespan is surprisingly the Saurians. The most visible Saurian that most of you know about is Ki-Adi-Mundi, aka Potato Head, droid attack on the Wookiees. He might look wise and old in appearance, but Saurians are a relatively short-lived species and also very infertile, which is kind of a bad way to sustain the survivability of a species. The Saurians' birth rate was so low that the Jedi Order would actually allow Ki-Adi-Mundi to have a family. Well, not just one family, he was allowed to be essentially a polygamist, and this was all in the name of saving his species, because we all know that Jedi are not allowed to have relationships and loved ones. Interesting to note, the Saurians have 2 brains in their head and require 2 hearts to get enough blood pumping into those brains. Unfortunately, they had the same weak human spine as we do, and so their heavy dome piece gives them severe back problems. The Gungans also live up to 65 years in age. These were an amphibious semi-sentient species that lived in the swamps of Naboo. Given their relatively primitive society, it's possible that a lack of good education and healthcare leads to bad life choices and outcomes for these simple people. The Gungans place their homes deep underwater. These areas are also home to many dangerous predators, which seems to cut down the Gungans' average lifespan significantly. There are many theories on what is inside of a Jawa's robe. Some people believe that they are descendants of humans who eventually devolved after being stuck on Tatooine for such a long time. Some people believe that Jawas share a common ancestor with the Tusken Raiders, who also share the Tatooine deserts with them. Either way, the Jawas were a short-lived species with a lifespan of 65 years of age. This could also be the result of their tiny size. Most Jawas never grow taller than a meter in height. But then again, Tatooine is a dangerous and terrible place to live. The fact that Jawas all steal to make a living increased their chance of being shot by homesteaders, further decreasing their lifespan. Okay, finally we get to move on to our next category, which is a lifespan of 60 years, a little bit shorter. In this category, we have one species, the Ewoks. Beloved for their taste of meat, the Ewoks are a semi-sentient species that were native to the forest moon of Endor. They lived in primitive tribes, usually in treetop villages. Their appearance, which has been described as a tiny little teddy bear, is misleading. The Ewoks have a very vicious warrior culture and enjoy eating their fallen enemies. They also have extremely dense bones and muscle fiber, and so they are quite strong for their size. Once discovered by the outside world, the forest moon of Endor became a large wild wildlife preserve where hunters could go and try their luck with some Ewok hunting. One huge factor when it comes to the Ewok's shorter lifespan is the destruction of the second Death Star while it was in orbit over the moon. While Rebel Alliance propaganda claims that the terrorist attack on the second Death Star didn't rain burning metal, toxins, and debris onto Endor, wiping out many of the forests on the surface of the planet, no one seems to be able to explain the shortage of Ewok meat that existed right after this event. In the 55-year average lifespan, we have two relatively disgusting species. First, the Rodents. These were essentially giant semi-sentient rodents. They could see in infrared and had teeth that could chew right through duracrete. Basically, the Rodents were everything you hate about rats, except they were bigger, around a meter in height. The Rodents were almost completely exterminated off of their homeworld Rider 2 when human colonists arrived onto that planet. Unfortunately, 3 Rodents stowed away on a spice freighter and were able to make it off-world and repopulate their entire species. The Rodents were incredibly fast breeders, and they also could eat basically anything, although they did have a preference for human babies. Given the fact that most Rodents were employed as soldiers or bounty hunters, probably affected their overall lifespan as well. Also, most sentient species in the galaxy saw the Rodents as repulsive and would try to shoot them on sight. Then we have the nohon, who also lived to 55 years in age on average. These were furry gremlin-like creatures who grew just a bit over a meter in height. They had really good vision, but poor smell. They preferred to climb and run through the trees as it protected them from their natural predators. Nohon were considered adults by the time they were 10 years old, and by the time they were 30 years old, they would start feeling the effects of aging. Any nohon who made it over 40 was considered pretty old. Next up, with an average lifespan of just 53 years, are the Tals. These were large biped aliens covered in white fur with a small insect-like proboscis for a mouth. The Tals were a violent species that lived in snowy and Arctic environments. Like many of the short-lived species on this list, they possessed only rudimentary Stone Age level technology. When the Empire first came across the Tals, they labeled them as a non-sentient species. This way they didn't have to give them the rights of sentience. This also made it a lot easier for the Empire to strip mine basically their planet. Despite their larger size, the Tals reached adulthood at around 9 years in age and were considered quite old by the time they hit their 40s. The urians were multi-limbed semi-sentient insectoids from the planet of Ruria. Their life cycle was quite similar to smaller insects. The urians started out life as a larva, and once they reached adolescence, they would enter the pupa stage and start creating a cocoon around themselves so that they can transform unharassed. In their final stage, the urians would unfurl large and beautiful chrome wings. They would spend this last stage of their life flying around, eating and mating. It was said that some urians really feared this transformation process. It could be that they were claustrophobic, I don't know. But most of these urians would eventually get a medical procedure which would keep them as a larva for the rest of their life. Gamorreans were amongst the dumbest sentient beings in the galaxy, which is why these pig-like aliens were oftentimes hired as cannon fodder and bodyguards by criminal cartels. Gamorreans were relatively simple creatures who lived in a clan-based society. While the Sows would hunt and farm, the Boars would constantly wage war with one another. But what made the Gamorreans so ineffective in combat was their love for melee weapons, in a world full of blasters and lasers. Most Gamorreans also lacked force sensitivity, so they were severely at a disadvantage in most combat situations. Now, Gamorreans have an average lifespan of only 45 years. Now, biologically, they should be able to live far past that, but their own stupidity and violent culture seems to be really limiting their average lifespan. Lastly, we have the nohon, another terrifying insectoid species which kind of looks like the common housefly. Standing at over just 1 meter tall, the nohons lived in communities known as welds, which could have anywhere from a few hundred to 10,000 members. Each one of these welds were ruled by an alpha male who had sole breeding rights with all of the females in his weld. Also, all of these females were basically seen as commodities and traded to other welds. As soon as a baby male nohon becomes an adolescent, they were usually driven out of a weld by the alpha. Many nohons would end up dying alone because of this cruel reality and imbalance in their society. Also, enslaving and becoming enslaved was a huge part of nohon culture, which also contributed to their shorter lifespan. So when it comes to the average lifespan for a species, it's not just about genetics and biological factors. Culture is also important. If your culture is really toxic or lacks safeguards to prevent accidental deaths, well, you might significantly reduce your average lifespan, like the Gamorreans did. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.